October in Vermont does not ask permission. It simply arrives, cold and magnificent, draping the hills in fire, burning the sugar maples down to their bones before the first hard frost finishes the job. From the east-facing window of Sterling House, Elena Vance had watched 10 Octobers come and go. 10 years of mornings where the Connecticut River Valley turned copper and amber and the kind of red that makes you forget, for one blinding second, that anything in the world could be wrong. This October, she couldn't look at the trees. The cardiac monitor had stopped its rhythm at 4:17 in the morning, a sound Elena had heard before during her years as a registered nurse at Central Vermont Medical Center in Berlin. She knew the exact weight of that silence, the way it filled a room, the way it pressed itself against your chest like a hand. She had sat beside Margaret Peggy Sterling for 11 minutes after the flatline, holding the old woman's hand, the way she had held it through 4 surgeries, 2 pneumonias, and a stroke that had stolen the use of her left side for 18 months. She didn't cry, not yet. She had learned long ago that grief, like the Vermont winter, was patient. It would find her when it was ready. What Elena did not expect, could not have expected, was the sound that broke the silence at 9:52 that same morning. Gravel. The long driveway of Sterling House was paved in crushed blue-gray stone, quarried from the same Barra granite that built half the gravestones in New England. When a car rolled over it slowly, it whispered. When 2 cars rolled over it fast, in convoy, the way men drive when they are already calculating square footage, it sounded like a verdict being read. Elena stood at the kitchen window, still in the same grey cardigan she'd worn through the night, a mug of lukewarm coffee from the old bun machine going cold between her palms. 2 black Cadillac Escalades came to a stop in front of the wraparound porch. The doors opened almost simultaneously, as if rehearsed. Julian Sterling stepped out first. He was 44 years old and wore it the way men who spend money on their appearance wear their age, efficiently. His charcoal wool coat had the quiet confidence of something bought on Madison Avenue, and he carried a leather portfolio under his arm that Elena recognized as the kind lawyers bring to real estate closings. He looked up at the house the way a developer looks at a teardown, with naked calculation dressed in polite appreciation. Sloane Sterling Holt emerged from the second SUV. Elena hadn't seen her since a Christmas card in 2019. A glossy photograph of Sloane at what appeared to be a Hamptons house, wearing sunglasses that probably cost more than Elena's monthly grocery budget. In person, on this cold Vermont morning, Sloane was thinner than the photograph suggested, and her eyes carried the particular restlessness of someone who has not slept well in several months. She wore heels on gravel, which told Elena everything she needed to know about how often Sloane Sterling Holt dealt with the practical world. Elena set down her coffee. She smoothed her cardigan. She walked to the front door and opened it before they could knock. Elena! Julian said her name the way people say the name of a town they've only heard of but never planned to visit. We came as fast as we could. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. The funeral home in Montpelier had been called at 5 in the morning. Peggy's body was not yet 24 hours gone. Her reading glasses were still folded on the nightstand upstairs. Her half-finished audiobook, she had been listening to a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt on a little Bluetooth speaker Elena had bought her 2 Christmases ago, was still paused at chapter 11. "I'm sure you did," Elena said. Her voice was level, soft even. Sloane stepped past Julian and into the foyer without being invited, glancing upward at the plaster medallion ceiling with its water stain shaped like the state of New Hampshire. Peggy used to joke about it during better years, calling it her free art installation. Sloane did not find it charming. She found it a liability. "The house looks tired," Sloane said. "It's been tired for a long time," Elena replied. "Some of us stayed anyway." The sentence landed, and landed clean. Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Sloane pretended to examine a framed photograph on the hallway wall. Peggy at 40, standing in front of the covered bridge on Northfield Road, laughing at something outside the frame. A man Eleanor didn't recognize came through the door behind them, mid-50s, navy suit, carrying a briefcase that matched Julian's portfolio in the way that suggested they had coordinated, or at least spoken to the same attorney's office that morning. He extended a hand. "Miss Vance, my name is Gerald Whitmore. I'm an estate attorney representing the Sterling family interests. I'm sorry for your loss." He did not look particularly sorry. He looked like a man with a schedule. Eleanor shook his hand once briefly. "We'll need access to the property records," Julian said, already moving toward the study at the end of the hall, his footsteps loud on the original 1887 hardwood floor. "And the deed. We should also talk about a timeline for the transition." Eleanor did not move. She stood in the center of the foyer, her hands folded in front of her, the cold October light coming through the side lights of the front door and catching the dust motes floating in the air around her, the ordinary and visible evidence of a life actually lived in this house. "The burial," she said quietly, "is on Thursday, at Hope Cemetery, in Barra." She wanted to be near the granite. She always said stone lasts longer than people remember you. Julian paused in the hallway. He turned just enough to acknowledge she had spoken. "Of course," he said. "We'll make sure everything is handled appropriately." He said it the way people say things they don't mean but believe are sufficient. Elena nodded slowly. She looked at Sloane, who had not said another word. There was something behind Sloane's eyes that might have been grief, or might have been the particular vertigo of a person who has returned to a place they abandoned and found it stranger than they left it. Elena almost felt sorry for her. Almost. She turned and walked back toward the kitchen, toward her cold coffee, and the pale Vermont morning and the half-finished biography of Eleanor Roosevelt, paused at chapter 11 upstairs. She said nothing more. There was nothing more to say, so not today. But she was calm in the way that the surface of a deep lake is calm, not because nothing is moving beneath it, but because everything moving beneath it knows exactly where it is going. In the top drawer of the writing desk in the second-floor study, the room Peggy had called her thinking room, and Julian had already mentally converted into a home office, sat a sealed envelope. It was addressed in Peggy Sterling's handwriting, in blue ink, in the careful cursive of a woman who had learned to write before keyboards existed. It read, simply, "For Elena. Open when it's time." The time had not yet come, but it was coming. Gerald Whitmore set his briefcase on the kitchen table as though he owned it. It was a good table, solid cherry wood, made by a furniture maker in Stowe whose shop had since closed, whose name Peggy used to say with the reverence people reserve for local artisans whose work outlasts them. Eleanor had eaten 3,000 meals at that table. She had paid bills there, clipped coupons there, sat across from Peggy on winter evenings playing two-handed gin rummy while the wood stove popped and hissed in the corner. She had also, on one particular Thursday in February 3 years ago, held Peggy's wrists at that table and talked her down from a panic attack, so severe the old woman had believed, for 12 minutes, that she was dying. Gerald Whitmore set his briefcase on it and clicked it open without asking. "I think we should all sit down," he said with the practiced warmth of a man who charges $400 an hour to be reasonable. Julian was already seated at the head of the table, Peggy's chair, the one with the worn armrests and the cushion tied on with a fraying ribbon. Eleanor noticed. She said nothing. She sat across from him, her hands flat on the wood, and waited. Sloane remained standing near the window, her arms crossed, looking out at the back garden where Peggy's raised vegetable beds stood empty and frost-bitten for the season. In July, those beds had been full of Cherokee purple tomatoes, Vortex green beans, and the particular variety of butternut squash that Peggy had been growing from the same saved seeds since 1987. Eleanor had planted them this past spring on her knees in the cold mud of early May because Peggy had asked her to, because the planting of seeds is an act of faith and Peggy Sterling had needed something to believe in. Sloane looked at the empty beds the way people look at things they don't recognize as meaningful. "I want to preface this conversation," Gerald said, opening a manila folder, "by expressing on behalf of the Sterling family their deep appreciation for the care you provided to Margaret over these past years." "Her name was Peggy," Elena said. "She hated Margaret. She said it made her sound like a school principal." A brief silence. Gerald smiled politely and continued. "Peggy, of course." He removed a document from the folder and slid it across the table. "This is the last will and testament of Margaret, of Peggy Sterling, executed in March of 2012. It has been properly filed with the Washington County Probate Court and is legally valid in the state of Vermont. Elena looked at the document without touching it. In summary, Gerald said, the estate, including the property at 14 Kingswood Ridge Road, all financial accounts, personal property, and holdings, passes in equal share to her 2 surviving children, Julian Allen Sterling and Sloane Marie Sterling Holt. He folded his hands. You are not mentioned in the document, Miss Vance. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a crow called once from the sugar maple at the edge of the yard, the one Peggy had named Harold, for reasons she never fully explained, and then went silent. I see, Elena said. Julian leaned forward slightly. He had the look of a man who had rehearsed this moment and found the rehearsal insufficient, because the woman across from him was not performing the scene he had prepared for. She was not crying, she was not defensive, she was simply present, in the way that people who have sat with dying patients learn to be present, without resistance, without theatre. We want to be fair about this, Julian said. He used the word fair the way people use it when they have already decided the outcome. We understand you've been living here as part of your arrangement with our mother. We're prepared to offer you 60 days to make other housing arrangements, plus a severance figure that Gerald's office has calculated based on comparable home care compensation in Washington County. He slid a second piece of paper across the table. Elena glanced at the number. It was not an insulting number in the way that some numbers are designed to insult. It was the kind of number that said, we did the math. We know what your years are worth in the market, and we are prepared to pay market rate to make you disappear cleanly. We're also asking, Sloane said from the window without turning around, that you not speak to the press. There's a non-disclosure clause in the severance agreement. Elena looked at the back of Sloane's head. She thought about the morning, 2 winters ago, when Sloane had not called on Peggy's birthday. She thought about the Christmas card. Generic, printed, signed by an assistant named according to the return label, K. Briggs. She thought about the 7 unanswered voicemails she had left on Sloane's cell phone during the week after Peggy's stroke, each one more urgent than the last, and the single text message that had finally come back 4 days later. Sorry, been traveling. Keep me posted. I won't be signing that, Elena said. Julian's expression shifted, only slightly, but Elena had spent a decade reading the faces of people under stress, and she could read the micro-fracture of irritation beneath his careful composure. Miss Vance, Gerald began. Elena, she said, please. Elena, he recalibrated. I understand this is a difficult time, the loss of someone you cared for deeply. She was my family, Elena said. Her voice did not waver, but something in it changed. A density, a weight that had not been there before. Not in the way the law defines it, in the way she defined it. She told me that herself, more than once. That's a lovely sentiment, Julian said. The word lovely landed like a small, deliberate stone. But sentiment isn't a legal instrument. Sloane turned from the window then. Something in Elena's words had found her, apparently, or perhaps it was just the cold finally coming through the old glass. She looked at Elena with an expression that was difficult to categorize. Not quite guilt, not quite grief, but something adjacent to both, like a distant cousin neither of them had invited. No one is saying you didn't care for her, Sloane said, and her voice had lost some of its earlier armor. But this is an estate matter. It has to be handled correctly. I agree completely, Elena said. Another silence, this one different in texture from the last. Gerald gathered his papers with the efficiency of a man who senses the meeting has traveled somewhere he wasn't prepared to go. We'll leave the severance offer with you. You don't need to decide anything today, but we will need the property keys and the access codes for the security system by the end of the week. Elena stood. She picked up her cold coffee mug, walked to the sink and poured it out. She ran the tap for a moment, watching the brown swirl down the drain. Then she turned around. The spare keys are on the hook by the back door, she said. They've been there for 10 years. You're welcome to them. She looked at Julian, she looked at Sloane. She looked last at Gerald Whitmore, who had the decency to look briefly uncomfortable. The full set of keys, she said, is with me. It always has been. Your mother preferred it that way. She left the kitchen without another word, walked upstairs to the room she had slept in for a decade, a modest room at the end of the hall, overlooking Harold the Crow's maple tree, and closed the door softly behind her. She sat on the edge of her bed. She pressed her hands together between her knees. She stared at the floor for a long time. Then she reached for her phone and dialed a number she had saved 3 months ago, at Peggy's specific instruction, under a contact name that read simply, Thomas Aldrich. Call when ready. It rang twice. "Miss Vance," said the voice on the other end, calm, unhurried, the voice of a man who had been expecting this call. "I was wondering when you'd reach out. I'm so sorry about Peggy." "Thank you," Elena said. "I think it's time." "Yes," Thomas Aldrich said. "I believe it is. Can you come to my office in Montpellier tomorrow morning? I have something that belongs to you." Downstairs, Julian Sterling stood at the kitchen window, looking out at his mother's empty garden beds, the portfolio still under his arm, the severance offer still on the cherry wood table. He pulled out his phone and called his real estate partner in New York. "It's clean," he said, without preamble. "Victorian, original hardwood, about 4,000 square feet. The land alone is worth holding. I'll send you photos tomorrow." He paused, listening. "The caretaker, nothing to worry about." He glanced toward the ceiling, toward the sound of Elena's footsteps moving slowly above him. "She's just the help." Montpellier, Vermont is the smallest state capital in the United States, a fact its residents mention with a pride that is entirely disproportionate to its population and entirely reasonable given its character. It sits at the confluence of the North Branch and the Winooski River, surrounded by hills that go gold in October and white in November, and stubbornly, magnificently green from May through September. The golden dome of the State House watches over State Street, the way a patient grandparent watches a family gathering, present, unhurried, having seen more than it will ever say. Elena parked her 2014 Honda CR-V on Elm Street and walked the 2 blocks to Thomas Aldrich's office. The morning was sharp and clear, the kind of Vermont October morning that makes you understand on a cellular level why people choose to stay here despite the winters. Her breath came in small white clouds. A man outside Capitol Grounds coffee shop held the door open for a woman with a stroller. And for one unguarded moment, Elena thought about how ordinary the world looked, how indifferent to private catastrophe, how beautifully, maddeningly normal. She pushed open the door of Aldrich and Foley, attorneys at law. The office smelled like old wood and good coffee, a combination Elena associated with places that had been doing serious work for a long time. The receptionist, a young woman with reading glasses pushed up into her hair, looked up and smiled. "Miss Vance, Attorney Aldrich is expecting you. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" "Coffee would be wonderful, thank you." Thomas Aldrich came into the waiting room himself, which Elena had not expected. He was somewhere in his mid-60s, a compact, deliberate man with white hair, a dark green sweater under a blazer, and the kind of unhurried handshake that belongs to people who are not trying to impress anyone. His eyes were steady and kind, and Elena noticed, already slightly red at the rims, the evidence of a grief that predated this morning. He liked her, Elena realized. He actually liked her. "I've known Peggy Sterling for 31 years, he said, as though he had heard the thought. He gestured toward the hallway. "Come in, please." His office was lined floor to ceiling with law books that looked genuinely read, and a single framed photograph on the desk showed a younger Thomas Aldrich standing with Peggy outside the Vermont State House, both of them laughing at something beyond the camera's edge. It was summer in the photograph. Peggy was wearing a yellow dress. Elena sat. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. She waited. "I want to tell you something before we get to the documents," Thomas said. He folded his hands on the desk. "Peggy came to me 14 months ago. She came alone on a Tuesday, and she walked in here and sat exactly where you're sitting, and she said—" He paused, and his voice carried the careful precision of a man quoting someone he intends to quote accurately. "Thomas, I have made a lot of mistakes in my life, but the people I love most are not mistakes, and I intend to make that very clear before I'm gone." Elena looked at the photograph on the desk. The yellow dress. The summer. Peggy laughing. "She told me about you," Thomas continued. not as an employee. She told me about the night you slept in the chair by her hospital bed for 3 days after her hip replacement. She told me about the reading glasses you ordered from 4 different vendors before you found the right prescription. She told me... He stopped again and cleared his throat in the way men of his generation clear their throats when sentiment threatens to become visible. She told me you learned to make her mother's gingerbread recipe from a handwritten card you found in a shoebox in the attic, and that you made it every December, and that it was the one thing that still smelled like home to her. The kitchen, the December mornings, the smell of molasses and dried ginger, and the old gas oven that took 4 minutes to preheat. Elena had made that gingerbread 7 times. She would never make it again in that kitchen, and the understanding of that arrived now quietly, without drama, and settled into the space behind her sternum. She loved you, Thomas said simply. She wanted you to know that this was not an accident or an afterthought. Everything she did with full legal clarity and full intentionality. He opened a folder. On April 14th of this year, Peggy Sterling executed 2 documents in this office, in the presence of 2 witnesses and a notary. The first is a codicil, a legal amendment, to her 2012 will, which modifies several specific bequests. The second... He removed a thick, bound document and set it between them. Is the Sterling family irrevocable trust? Eleanor looked at the document. The cover page read, The Sterling Family Irrevocable Trust, established April 14th by Margaret Eleanor Sterling, grantor. Below the title, in the clean language of legal instruments that have been drafted very carefully by someone who anticipated resistance, Trustee of Record, Elena Marie Vance. The room was very quiet. I don't understand, Elena said. She understood perfectly. She needed a moment anyway. An irrevocable trust, Thomas said, with the patient clarity of a man who has explained complex things to people in states of shock before, means that once it's created, it cannot be changed, contested, or dissolved by the grantor or by any beneficiary. Peggy transferred the entirety of the Sterling estate into this trust, the property, the investment accounts, the historical preservation endowment, everything. It is now administered exclusively by the trustee. He paused. By you. Elena set down her coffee mug. Julian and Sloane are named as beneficiaries, Thomas continued. They are entitled to distributions from the trust, but those distributions, every single one, of any amount, require the signature and authorization of the trustee. Of you. He let that settle. Without your signature, they cannot access a single dollar of the Sterling estate. The silence stretched between them, warm and enormous. She also left you a letter, Thomas said. He slid a sealed envelope across the desk. It was cream-colored, heavy stock, and Elena recognized the handwriting instantly, that careful, slightly formal cursive, blue ink, the looping capital E that Peggy had always made with a flourish, as though the letter deserved special attention. Elena picked it up. She did not open it. Not yet. Some things require privacy. What happens when they find out? She asked. Thomas Aldrich leaned back in his chair slightly. The ghost of a smile crossed his face. Not unkind, but knowing. The smile of a man who has been a lawyer for 4 decades and has watched human nature perform its most predictable routines with unfailing consistency. Julian will call his own attorney within the hour, he said. He'll be told the trust is unassailable. Peggy was of full sound mind. The documents are airtight, and Vermont trust law does not provide a meaningful avenue for contest. Then he will be angry. Then he will try to negotiate. And then, Thomas paused, he will have to come to you. And Sloane? Thomas considered. Sloane is more complicated than she appears, but that's my read. And I've been wrong before. Eleanor stood. She tucked the envelope into her coat pocket against her chest, where she could feel its weight with each breath. She extended her hand. Thank you, Thomas, for taking care of her. She took care of herself, he said, shaking her hand firmly. You just made sure she had the time to do it. Eleanor walked out of the office and back onto State Street. The golden dome of the State House caught the morning sun and threw it back, bright and indifferent and permanent. A group of school children in matching yellow vests was crossing the street in a diagonal line, their teacher at the front, counting heads with practiced anxiety. A food truck near the corner of Main Street was doing early lunch business, the smell of maple-glazed bacon drifting half a block. And somewhere up on the hill, a dog was barking at nothing in particular, or perhaps at everything. Eleanor stood on the sidewalk for a long moment. She put her hand flat against her coat pocket. She felt the envelope there, the weight of it, the finality, and the love and the strategy all folded together inside a cream-colored rectangle. Then she walked back to her car, drove south on Interstate 89 and returned to Sterling House. Her house for now. For now. Julian's call to his New York attorney lasted 47 minutes. The attorney's final assessment, delivered in the measured tone of someone accustomed to delivering bad news to men who do not like receiving it, was this. "The trust is clean, Julian. I've seen the filing. Whoever drafted it knew exactly what they were doing. Your options are limited, your timeline is short, and the woman holding the pen is under no legal obligation to hand it to you." Julian ended the call. He stood in the kitchen of Sterling House, his mother's kitchen, the cherry wood table still holding the untouched severance offer he had slid across it yesterday, and he looked at the empty chair where Elena Vance had sat, perfectly still, perfectly calm, like someone who had known something he didn't, because she had. Eleanor did not open the letter immediately. She drove back from Montpellier with it sitting on the passenger seat beside her, still sealed, still cream-colored, still holding whatever Peggy had decided to say in the particular privacy of a Tuesday afternoon in April, when she had known with the clear-eyed practicality of a woman who had survived a stroke and 2 rounds of cardiac surgery that she was running out of Tuesdays. She stopped at the Shaw's grocery store on Bar Street in Montpellier on the way back, not because she needed anything, but because she needed 5 minutes inside a place that was entirely ordinary. She walked the produce aisle slowly. She looked at the Vermont apples stacked in careful pyramids, Honeycrisp and Cortland and Macoun, the names of autumn in this part of the world. She picked up a Cortland and turned it in her hand and put it back. She bought a small bunch of white dahlias from the flower display near the entrance, because Peggy had kept dahlias on the kitchen windowsill every October without fail, and the windowsill was bare now, and that particular wrongness felt like something that could be corrected. She drove the rest of the way to Sterling House with the dahlias on the seat beside the letter. The Escalades were still in the driveway. She had not expected them to leave. She went in through the back door, put the dahlias in a glass of water on the kitchen windowsill, and carried the letter upstairs to her room. She sat in the chair by the window, her reading chair, a wingback she had reupholstered herself 4 years ago in a dark green fabric that matched the hills in summer, and she held the envelope in both hands for a moment. Then she opened it. The letter was 4 pages, written front and back in Peggy's careful cursive blue ink, dated April 14th, the same day as the trust documents. The handwriting was steadier than Elena had expected, given how Peggy's hands had trembled in the last year. She must have written it in the morning, Elena thought, when the tremor was always less. She read it through once without stopping. Then she read it again, more slowly, her thumb running along the edge of the paper, the way you touch something you want to memorize. "My dear Elena, I have been trying to write this letter for 6 months, and I keep getting it wrong, so I am going to stop trying to get it right and just tell you the truth, which is what you have always deserved from me and what I have not always been brave enough to give you. You came to this house 10 years ago as a nurse, and I kept you here because I was afraid. That is the truth I have been avoiding. I was afraid of being alone. I was afraid of the stairs and the winter, and the particular silence that settles into a house when no one who loves you is in it. And you stayed, and I told myself it was an arrangement, a practical matter, and I let you believe that for longer than I should have. It was never an arrangement. You are the best thing that happened to this house since the people who built it were still alive. I want you to know a few things before I go. The first is that I know what you gave up. I know about the position at Fletcher Allen that you were offered in 2016 and turned down without telling me. Dr. Reyes mentioned it eventually. I cried about that for 3 days, and then I made myself stop because guilt is a useless emotion, and I needed to think clearly. I have been trying to make it right ever since. The second is that Julian and Sloane are not bad people. I need you to understand that, even though I know what is coming. They are people who learn to love things more than people, which is a specific kind of damage that I take some responsibility for. I was not always present. I was not always brave. Their father was not easy, and I was not easy, and the house was not easy, and I gave them money when I should have given them time. You cannot fix a childhood with an inheritance, I know that now. But they need to learn something before they receive anything from me. They need to learn what this family actually costs, not in dollars, in presence, in showing up, in being inconvenient for someone else's sake. That is what the trust is for. That is what you are for. You are not their punishment, Elena. You are their teacher. Whether they want to be taught is entirely up to them. The third thing I want to tell you is this. The gingerbread recipe is yours. The whole shoebox is yours. It is in the top shelf of the closet in the thinking room, and it contains letters and photographs and my mother's handwritten recipes and a pressed violet from my wedding day, and none of it belongs to anyone who wasn't there. I love you, Elena. I'm sorry it took me this long to write it down. Take care of the garden. Harold the Crow is fine on his own. He doesn't need you, but the garden needs you. Peggy. Eleanor sat with the letter in her lap for a long time. Outside the window, Harold the Crow made one brief declarative sound from his maple tree and then was quiet. The October light moved slowly across the floorboards the way it does in late afternoon, unhurried and golden and final. She cried then, not dramatically, no heaving, no gasping. Just the steady, cleaning kind of grief that comes when the person you loved knew you completely and said so, in writing, in blue ink, in their own hand, on the best paper they owned. She allowed herself 20 minutes. Then she folded the letter carefully along its original creases, put it back in the envelope, and placed it in the drawer of her nightstand beside her nursing license, which she had never let expire through all 10 years, because some things you keep even when you are not using them, because you never know. She washed her face. She went downstairs. Julian was waiting for her in the front parlor, standing with his back to the fireplace in the manner of men who position themselves in rooms to suggest authority. The fire was not lit. He had apparently not been able to find the matches, which were in the blue ceramic jar on the mantel that had always held the matches, but which he would not have known to look in. "We need to talk," he said. "All right," Elena said. She sat in the wingback chair by the window, Peggy's chair, the good one, the one with the view of the garden, and folded her hands in her lap. Julian remained standing. Elena suspected this was deliberate. "I spoke with my attorney in New York this morning," he said. "He's reviewed the trust documents. I assumed he would. He says they're legitimate." The word came out with a slight friction, like something he had swallowed wrong. "He says the structure is unusual but legally sound." "Your mother had an excellent attorney," Elena said. Julian looked at her steadily. Up close, without the portfolio under his arm and the cold performance of the morning before, he looked tired. Not soft. Julian Sterling did not appear to do soft, but tired in the way of a man who has been running a calculation that keeps returning the wrong answer. "I want to make a deal," he said. "I'm listening." 50%. Sloane and I sign over 50% of our inheritance entitlement to you, liquid assets only, no claim on the property, in exchange for your full and unconditional cooperation as trustee, meaning you process all distributions without conditions or delays. We walk away with half. You walk away with more money than you've seen in your life." He paused. "It's a reasonable offer." Elena looked at him for a moment. She thought about the letter upstairs in her nightstand. She thought about Peggy's third point. They are not bad people. They are people who learn to love things more than people, and she tried sincerely to hold that with some generosity. Then she thought about the phone call he had made in this kitchen 2 days ago. She's just the help. "Your mother didn't create this trust to give me money, Julian," she said. Her voice was even, almost gentle. "She created it to give you something harder than money." "And what is that?" Eleanor stood. She crossed to the fireplace and found the matches in the blue ceramic jar, first try, and lit the fire with the ease of someone who has done it 10,000 times. The kindling caught. The warmth began to move. She put the matches back in the jar. "An opportunity," she said. I'll explain the details when Sloane is in the room. I'd like to say this once." Julian stared at her. The fire behind her was beginning to take hold, the light of it catching the silver at her temples, and in that moment, though he would never have said so, not to anyone, not even to himself at 3 in the morning when the truth tends to arrive uninvited, she looked less like a caretaker and more like someone who had been waiting with extraordinary patience to begin. Sloane was in the thinking room when Elena came to find her. She was standing at the closet. The door was open. She was holding a shoebox. Elena stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her. Sloane had not opened the box. She was just holding it, the way you hold something when you're not sure if you have the right. "That belongs in the closet," Elena said quietly. "Your mother left instructions about it." Sloane looked up. Her eyes were red. She had been crying, not the performative kind, not the kind you arrange your face around, but the private, inconvenient kind that happens when you are alone in a room that smells like someone you did not visit enough. She put the shoebox back on the shelf without a word, and Elena, who had spent 10 years caring for a woman these two had left behind, felt the first faint, complicated stirring of something that was not quite sympathy, but was not quite its opposite either. It was perhaps the beginning of understanding, or the beginning of something harder than that. Elena made dinner. This was not a strategic decision, or perhaps it was, but not in the way Julian would have interpreted it. It was simply what she did when the house needed steadying. She had cooked in this kitchen through Peggy's darkest winters, through the January of the hip replacement, through the February of the second cardiac event, through the March when the pipes froze and the power went out for 4 days, and the two of them had eaten canned soup heated on the camp stove and played every card game either of them knew by the light of 3 fat pillar candles. Food was not comfort exactly. It was continuity. It was the insistence that tomorrow exists and will require eating. She made a chicken pot pie from scratch, the recipe from Peggy's own index cards, the pastry rolled out on the floured counter the way Peggy had shown her in the second winter, the filling thick with the last of the season's root vegetables from the cold storage in the basement. The kitchen filled with the smell of butter and thyme and slow heat, and Elena worked steadily and without hurry, and did not think about anything except what her hands were doing. At 6 o'clock, she stood at the bottom of the stairs and said, with the carrying, neutral tone of someone who has managed difficult people in difficult situations for a very long time, "Dinner is ready. I'd like us all to eat together." There was a pause from upstairs, then footsteps. First Julian's, decisive, irritated, the footsteps of a man who has decided to interpret a dinner invitation as a negotiation tactic, which it was, though not the kind he expected. Then Sloane's, slower, uncertain, the footsteps of someone navigating a house they once knew and no longer recognize. They sat at the cherrywood table. Elena set 3 places with Peggy's everyday dishes, blue and white transferware, chipped at the rims in the particular way of things that have been used without apology for 40 years. She poured water from a pitcher. She brought the pot pie to the table in the cast-iron dish it had been baked in, and set it on the trivet that had lived in the center of that table for as long as Elena had been in the house. She sat down. The 3 of them looked at the pot pie. "She made this," Sloane said. It was not quite a question. "The recipe is hers," Elena said. "I made this one." Sloane looked at the dish for another moment. Then she picked up her fork. Julian served himself with the brisk efficiency of a man determined not to find anything meaningful in a meal. He cut into the pastry. Steam rose, he ate. His expression did not change, but he reached for a second serving 8 minutes later without appearing to notice he had done so, which Elena found quietly satisfying. They ate in a silence that was not entirely hostile. Outside, the wind had come up, moving through the sugar maples along the ridge with the low, sustained sound that Vermonters call the mountain breathing. The fire in the parlor, Elena had kept it going, sent warmth through the ground floor, and the old house made its familiar evening sounds. The tick of the radiator in the hallway, the particular creak of the 3rd stair that no one had ever bothered to fix because Peggy said it was useful, like a doorbell. She really lived here, Sloane said quietly. She was looking at the windowsill, at the white dahlias in the glass. I knew she lived here, but this was her whole world, wasn't it? It was the most honest thing Sloane had said since she arrived, and Elena recognized it as such. She loved this house, Elena said. She loved the view from the thinking room in the morning. She loved that the neighbors 3 miles down the road still brought her a jar of maple syrup every spring. She loved that she could hear the Winooski from the back porch when the spring melt came. She loved, Elena paused, that she was known here. That people at the hardware store in Montpelier knew her name and asked after her garden. Julian set down his fork. Is this the part where you tell us what terrible children we were? No, Elena said. Your mother already did that, in a letter she left me, and she was considerably more generous about it than I might have been. Something crossed Julian's face that Elena could not fully read. She filed it away. She said you're not bad people, Elena continued matter-of-factly, as though she were reporting weather. She said you're people who learned to love things more than people, and that she took some responsibility for that. I thought you should know she said it. The wind moved through the maples again, the fire ticked. Sloane's eyes were very bright, and she was looking at the table with the focused attention of someone who is holding themselves together by concentrating on the grain of the wood. The conditions, Julian said. His voice was controlled, but Elena heard the thing underneath it. Not anger exactly, but the particular strain of a man who was prepared for combat and found himself instead at a dinner table eating his dead mother's pot pie, which is a profoundly disorienting experience. You said you'd explain the conditions. Yes, Elena said. She folded her hands on the table. She had thought carefully about how to say this. Not the words were simple, but the register. Not punitive, not triumphant. Peggy had been clear about that in the letter. You are their teacher, not their punishment. The trust gives me full discretion over distributions, she began. I can release funds at any time and in any amount, at my sole judgment. I can also decline to release funds for any reason, indefinitely. Thomas Aldrich has confirmed that there is no legal mechanism to compel me to sign anything. That's not a threat. It's just the landscape. Julian nodded tightly. He knew the landscape. He had paid his New York attorney $800 an hour to describe it to him in exhaustive, discouraging detail. What I'm going to ask of you, Elena said, is not from me. It is from your mother. She was very specific, and I am going to honor what she asked as precisely as I can. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and unfolded a single sheet of paper, her own handwriting this time, transcribed from the relevant passage of Peggy's letter, the part she had reread 3 times to make sure she had it right. Peggy asks that each of you commit to 100 hours of volunteer service at the Central Vermont Medical Center in Berlin, specifically in the long-term care ward. Not administrative work, not a donation. Physical presence once a week for the duration of the commitment. You would be doing what the staff and volunteers do, sitting with patients, reading to them, helping with meals, being company for people who don't have enough of it. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. It had a texture to it, something between disbelief and the particular discomfort of a proposal you cannot immediately dismiss. She died in that ward, Sloane said softly. She did, Elena said. In room 14, the staff there knew her. They knew her preferences and her humor, and which television programs she liked, and which ones she found depressing. They were kind to her, and they are kind to everyone in that ward every day with almost no recognition and salaries that do not reflect what the work actually costs a person. She paused. Your mother wanted you to understand what that work looks like up close. She wanted you to be changed by it if it changed you, and she hoped it would. Julian leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling, the plaster medallion, the water stains shaped like New Hampshire, and he breathed slowly through his nose the way people breathe when they are managing an emotion they have not named yet. And if we refuse, he said. The trust continues indefinitely, with me as sole administrator, Elena said. The estate generates income. The investment accounts, the historical preservation endowment. That income is donated quarterly to causes Peggy designated in the trust document, the Vermont Land Trust, the Berlin Food Shelf, and the Scholarship Fund at the nursing program at Vermont State University in Randolph. She said it evenly. The house is maintained. The garden is planted every spring. The maple syrup continues to arrive from the neighbors down the road. Everything continues except that neither of you receive anything from it. That's, Julian started. Legal, Elena said. Completely, entirely. Thomas Aldrich has reviewed it 4 times legal. Another silence. Julian looked at his sister. Sloane was still looking at the table, at the grain of the cherry wood, her thumb moving slowly along the edge of her water glass. She planned this for a long time, Sloane said. It was not an accusation. It was the quiet astonishment of someone understanding, perhaps for the first time, the depth of their underestimation. 14 months, Elena said. She came to Thomas Aldrich 14 months ago. She was thorough. She was always thorough, Sloane said, and something in her voice cracked just slightly at the seam, not breaking but showing where the break would come eventually when she was alone. She kept every receipt, every birthday card. She had a filing system for everything. She had a filing system for you, Elena said, and she said it gently because it was true. Both of you, every card you ever sent her, every photograph, every letter. It's in the filing cabinet in the study, alphabetical by year. She kept everything. Sloane made a sound that was not quite a word. Julian stood abruptly. He carried his plate to the sink, with the contained, deliberate motion of a man removing himself from a situation before the situation removed him. He stood at the sink with his back to them, looking out the dark window at the shape of the garden he had not looked at when it was light. "I need to think," he said. "Of course," Elena said. "You have time. The trust is not going anywhere." He left the kitchen. His footsteps went upstairs, the 3rd stair creaking its familiar note. And then the sound of the guest room door closing, not quite a slam, but close. Sloane and Elena sat alone at the table, with the remnants of the pot pie and the white dahlias, and the low sound of the Vermont wind. "Did she suffer?" Sloane asked. "At the end." Elena considered the question honestly, the way Peggy had always asked her to consider questions. "The last week was hard," she said, "but the last night was peaceful. I was with her. She was not afraid." Sloane nodded. She pressed her lips together. She nodded again. "Thank you," she said, "for being there." Elena picked up her water glass and held it for a moment. "She would have thanked you too," she said, "if you had been." It was the hardest thing she had said in 4 days. She said it without cruelty, but without softening it either, because Peggy had asked her to be honest, and some kindnesses are not kind. Sloane received it without flinching. She sat with it, the way you sit with something true that you have been avoiding, and she did not look away. At 9 o'clock that night, Elena went up to the thinking room and retrieved the shoebox from the top shelf of the closet. She carried it to her room and sat cross-legged on her bed and opened it slowly. Inside, recipes on index cards in 3 different handwritings, Peggy's and her mother's and a grandmother's that Elena had never met. Photographs in small stacks bound with rubber bands, a pressed violet, thin as paper, still faintly purple. Letters tied with kitchen twine. A grocery list from 1974, written on the back of an envelope, that ended with half-pint cream, good bread, and something for the children. Elena held the grocery list for a long time, something for the children. Written by a woman who was gone, for children who were now in their 70s, in a house that was still standing. She put everything carefully back. She set the box on her nightstand, next to the letter. Outside, Harold the Crow was silent in his maple tree. The house breathed around her, its old timbers, its century-old plaster, its 10 years of her own footsteps worn soft into the hallway floor. She turned off the lamp. She lay in the dark and listened to the mountain breathing. Tomorrow, she thought, would be the beginning of something. She did not yet know what. But she had learned in 10 years of caring for someone else's life that beginnings rarely announce themselves. They arrive the way grief does, the way October does, without permission, quietly. And then, all at once, the hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning at the Washington County Courthouse on State Street in Montpelier, 4 blocks north of Thomas Aldrich's office, and directly across from the granite steps where Peggy Sterling had once been photographed, laughing in a yellow dress, on a summer afternoon that now existed only in a framed photograph and in the memory of one aging attorney who kept it on his desk. Julian had hired Patterson and Crow, a Burlington firm that specialized in estate litigation and had the kind of website that featured black and white photographs of serious people looking out of tall windows. Their lead attorney, a woman named Christine Beaumont, was sharp and well prepared and had spent 2 weeks building the most viable challenge available to her, which, as she had privately told Julian during their third consultation, was not a strong one. "The trust is clean," she had said, with the frankness of an attorney who charges for her honesty. "But we have one angle worth pursuing. We argue that the trustee has a fiduciary conflict of interest, that Miss Vance stands to benefit personally from withholding distributions, and that this constitutes a breach of her duty to act in the beneficiary's interests. It's a stretch, but it creates delay, and sometimes delay is leverage." Julian had authorized the filing. Delay, in his experience, was a tool like any other. What he had not accounted for was Thomas Aldrich. Thomas Aldrich had been practicing law in Vermont for 39 years. He had argued before the Vermont Supreme Court on 4 separate occasions. He had drafted more trust instruments than he could count, and he had anticipated, with the patient foresight of a man who had known Peggy Sterling for 3 decades and had drafted her trust with the explicit expectation of a challenge, every single argument Christine Beaumont's brief contained. He had also 6 months ago, at Peggy's specific request, included in the trust document a clause so precisely worded that when Christine Beaumont read it during her preparation, she had set the brief down, rubbed her eyes, and said to her paralegal, "She had good counsel." The clause established that any legal challenge to the trust by a named beneficiary, if unsuccessful, would result in a mandatory 18-month suspension of that beneficiary's distribution eligibility. It was, in the language of estate law, a no-contest provision, common enough in wills, unusual in trusts, and in this case drafted with a specificity that left no interpretive daylight whatsoever. Elena sat in the second row of the courtroom with Thomas Aldrich at the table beside her. She wore the dark navy blazer she had bought 3 years ago for a hospital fundraising gala she had attended as Peggy's companion, and which she had not worn since. Her hair was up. Her hands were folded on the table. She looked, the court reporter would later tell a colleague over lunch at a State Street sandwich shop, like a person who had already read the last page of a book and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Christine Beaumont made a competent argument. She was organized and measured and cited 4 relevant Vermont statutes and 2 out-of-state precedents. The judge, a woman named Honorable Patricia Okafor, who had been on the Washington County bench for 11 years and had the expression of someone who had stopped being surprised by human behavior during the second Bush administration, listened without visible reaction and took notes in a small leather-bound pad. Thomas Aldrich's response took 14 minutes. He addressed the fiduciary conflict argument first, dismantling it with the calm efficiency of a man taking apart something he had built himself and therefore understood from the inside. He cited the trust document's explicit language, the notarized testimony of the 2 witnesses present at signing, both of whom had submitted affidavits attesting to Peggy Sterling's full mental clarity and voluntary intent, and a 2019 Vermont Supreme Court ruling that established nearly identical precedent. Then he reached the no contest clause. He read it aloud into the record, all 47 words of it. Slowly and clearly, the way you read something when you want to make absolutely sure everyone in the room understands that it means exactly what it says. Christine Beaumont was a professional, and professionals do not visibly react to adverse developments in a courtroom. But Elena, watching from the second row, saw the almost imperceptible pause, the half-second of stillness that preceded her turning to say something quietly to the associate sitting beside her. Judge Okafor looked up from her notepad. "Counsel," she said, addressing Christine Beaumont with the dry precision of someone who has made her mind up and is offering one last opportunity to be reasonable, "are you prepared to address the no contest provision?" There was a pause that lasted approximately 3 seconds and contained, Elena felt, a considerable amount of information. "Your Honor," Christine said carefully, "my client was not made fully aware of that provision prior to filing." The judge looked at her for a moment. "He is now," she said. She ruled from the bench. The challenge was denied. The trust stood, complete and unaltered, every clause intact. Julian Sterling's distribution eligibility was suspended for 18 months, effective immediately, per the terms he had triggered by filing the challenge in the first place. The gavel came down with the sound of a period at the end of a very long sentence. Julian sat very still in the front row. He was wearing his good coat again, the Madison Avenue one, and it looked, Elena thought, slightly less confident than it had 4 days ago when he had stepped out of the Escalade onto the gravel driveway of Sterling House. Not shabby. Julian Sterling would not permit shabby, but diminished the way expensive things look when the occasion turns out to be larger than their price tag. Elena gathered her papers. She did not look at him. She was not performing restraint. She genuinely felt no desire to witness his humiliation. Peggy had not designed this as a humiliation. It was a correction. There was a difference, and Elena intended to honor it. She did look at Sloane, who had come to the hearing and sat in the gallery behind her brother, and had not, as far as Elena could tell, said a single word to him before or after the ruling. Sloane met her eyes briefly. Her expression was unreadable, in the specific way of someone reading 2 things at once and not yet sure which one is true. Outside on the granite steps of the courthouse, in the cold October air, Thomas Aldrich stood beside Elena and looked out at State Street with the satisfied expression of a man who has done exactly what he set out to do. "Peggy wrote that clause herself, you know," he said. "The language was hers. I refined the legal wording, but the idea, the architecture of it, was entirely hers." He paused. "She was a formidable woman." "She was," Elena agreed. "What happens now?" he asked. Not as her attorney, the professional question had been answered inside, definitively. As someone who had known Peggy Sterling for 31 years and was genuinely curious what she had set in motion. Elena looked up the hill toward the dome of the State House, gold in the thin October sun. A pigeon landed on the granite railing beside her and regarded her with the serene indifference of a creature that has never had to think about inheritance law. "Now," Elena said, "I wait to see who Julian Sterling decides to be." She walked down the steps toward Elm Street and her Honda, and the drive back down Interstate 89 toward a house that was, for the moment, entirely hers to keep. Julian did not return to Sterling House that afternoon. He drove instead to a coffee shop on Main Street in Montpelier, not the one nearest the courthouse, which might contain people who had been in that courtroom, but a smaller one on the north end of the street, a place called Red Hen that smelled like fresh bread and ground coffee, and had no particular association with anything that had happened to him in the past week. He sat at a corner table. He ordered a black coffee. He sat with it for a long time without drinking it. He was thinking about something Christine Beaumont had said to him in the hallway outside the courtroom, in the clipped, careful tone of an attorney closing a file. "Your mother knew exactly what she was doing, Mr. Sterling. In my experience, people don't build instruments this precise unless they understand the people they're building them for." He had not answered her. He had not had an answer. The coffee went cold. He sat with it anyway. At some point, he was not certain exactly when, he stopped thinking about the money. He started thinking about his mother in a yellow dress, laughing at something outside the frame of a photograph on a summer day he had not been present for, in a life she had built around herself after he had stopped coming home. He sat with that for a long time, too. Then he put on his coat, left a $10 bill on the table, and drove back to Sterling House. Sloane called first. It was a Sunday morning in early November, 3 weeks after the courthouse, and Elena was in the garden turning the last of the vegetable beds for winter, a task that involves driving a fork deep into cold soil and opening it to the frost, which kills what needs killing and preserves what needs preserving. It is not gentle work. It smells like iron and November, and the particular finality of things going dormant with the intention of returning. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She pulled off one glove and answered. "I called the medical center in Berlin," Sloane said without preamble. Her voice had lost the careful social finish it had carried when she arrived, the socialite's veneer that Elena had clocked immediately as expensive armor. What was underneath it was quieter and less polished and considerably more real. "I spoke to someone in the volunteer services office, a woman named Donna. She was very kind about it." Elena straightened up. She stood in the middle of the garden with the fork in one hand and the phone in the other, and she looked at the bare beds and the frost-silvered grass, and Harold's maple tree, which had dropped all its leaves now and stood clean and black against the pale November sky. "Donna runs good programs," Elena said. She had worked alongside Donna Persichetti for 2 years before she came to Sterling House, and knew her to be the kind of person who made difficult things feel manageable without ever pretending they were easy. "She said she could start me on Tuesdays," Sloane said. "In the long-term care ward. She said they always need more people on Tuesdays because she said Tuesdays are the loneliest day for the patients. Families come on weekends. Tuesdays nobody comes." There was a pause. Elena heard in it the sound of something rearranging itself inside a person, the particular inner quiet of someone who has just understood something they cannot ununderstand. "I'll be in Vermont in 2 weeks," Sloane said. "I've sublet my apartment in the city. I thought I might stay at the house if that's all right, while I do the hours. It might take several months and I don't want to do this from a hotel." Elena looked at the house. Its October fire was gone, but the old Victorian stood solid and pale against the tree line, smoke beginning to curl from the chimney she had lit that morning, its windows catching the flat November light with the patient dignity of a structure that has housed more history than any of its current occupants. "The guest room is yours," Elena said. Sloane exhaled. One short compressed sound, not quite a sob, not quite relief, but the specific release of someone who has been holding a breath for longer than they realized. "Thank you, Elena." "Don't thank me yet," Elena said. "Tuesdays are hard." "I know," Sloane said. "That's why I picked them." Elena pressed the phone against her shoulder for a moment after the call ended. The cold air moved through the garden. A chickadee landed on the fence post at the far end of the bed and regarded her with the bright, uncomplicated attention of a creature with no opinion on estate law whatsoever. She put her glove back on and drove the fork back into the earth. Julian took longer. It was December, the second week, the kind of Vermont December that arrives with absolute commitment. Snow on the ground since Thanksgiving, the Winooski frozen along its edges, the sky the particular shade of white that means more is coming. When he knocked on the door of the study where Elena was at the desk, reviewing the trust's quarterly accounts. "Do you have a minute?" he said. It was not quite a question. She gestured to the chair across from the desk. He sat in it, not at the head of anything, not positioning himself near a fireplace. Just a man in a chair, in a house that had belonged to his mother, across a desk from a woman he had called the help. He did not apologize. Elena had not expected an apology and had not required one. What Julian Sterling offered instead was, in its own way, more costly than an apology. He offered an accounting. "I've been thinking about the job in New York," he said, "the one you gave up in 2016. He looked at the desk rather than at her. "I know about the Fletcher Allen position. Christine Beaumont found it during her research. A senior charge nurse role. It would have been a significant step up." Elena said nothing. She waited. "I've been trying to figure out," he said slowly, "what a person looks like who makes that decision, who turns down something they worked for someone who—" He stopped, restarted. For someone who wasn't paying them enough and wasn't their family and had 2 actual children who should have been doing it instead. The radiator ticked in the hall. Somewhere outside, a snowplow was moving down Kingswood Ridge Road with the low, grinding patience of municipal winter. "She was lonely," Elena said simply, "and I was in a position to help. It's not more complicated than that." "It is more complicated than that," Julian said. "You just don't need it to be." He looked up then, and Elena saw something in his face that she recognized from years of working with patients. Not illness, but the specific vulnerability of a person who has run out of defenses and is deciding in real time whether to be afraid of that or not. "I called the medical center," he said. "I start on Thursdays. They put me in the ward." A pause. "Same ward." "Room 14 is empty right now," Elena said. "They'll assign you elsewhere." "I asked to be near it," he said. "If there's an opening." The room was very quiet. Elena looked at Julian Sterling, at the expensive coat that no longer looked quite so expensive, at the hands that were his mother's hands. She noticed now for the first time the same long fingers, the same way of holding them slightly curled at rest. and she thought about Peggy's letter. They are not bad people. They are people who learned to love things more than people. And she thought about the grocery list from 1974. Something for the children. This perhaps was what Peggy had meant. Not the trust, not the conditions, not the legal architecture of an irrevocable instrument drafted on a Tuesday in April. This moment. Two people in a study, in an old house in Vermont in December, looking at each other across a desk with the plain, undecorated knowledge of what had been lost and what might, with effort, still be recovered. "I'll process the first distribution when your hours are complete," Elena said. "Yours and Sloane's both. Thomas will handle the paperwork." Julian nodded. He moved to stand, then stopped. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "After." He said it with genuine uncertainty, not as strategy, not as calculation, as a question. "With the house, with your own life. You gave 10 years to this place. What do you actually want?" Elena was quiet for a moment. Through the window behind the desk, she could see the back garden, snow-covered now, the raised beds white and patient, waiting for May. The snowplow had moved on down the road. The house was very still around them both. "I want to plant the garden in the spring," she said. "I want to make the gingerbread in December. I want to keep the filing system." She paused. "And in the fall, when the positions open up at the medical center, I want to go back to nursing. Part-time, maybe. Donna said there's a role in the long-term care ward if I want it." Julian looked at her for a moment, with an expression she could not entirely name. "That's it," he said, not dismissively, genuinely. "That's everything," Elena said. On a Tuesday in late January, Sloane Sterling Holt sat in a chair beside the bed of a 91-year-old man named Walter Briggs, no relation to the assistant who had signed Peggy's Christmas cards, who had been in the long-term care ward for 4 months, and whose daughter visited on alternating Sundays, and who spent the hours in between listening to a small radio tuned to a country station out of Barra. Sloane did not know anything about country music. She knew a great deal about gallery openings and restaurant reservations, and the particular social geography of the Upper East Side, none of which was useful in room 9 of the long-term care ward on a Tuesday afternoon in January. She sat with Walter Briggs for 3 hours. She listened to the radio with him. She learned that his wife had been named Ruth and had died in 2019, and had made a coconut cake every Easter that Walter described in enough detail that Sloane could have attempted the recipe. She learned that Walter had worked for 30 years at the Rock of Ages granite quarry in Graniteville, and had a grandson at UVM studying civil engineering, and a dog named Senator who was being kept by a neighbor. When the volunteer shift ended, and Sloane stood to leave, Walter Briggs reached out and patted her hand once, briefly, the way very old people touch things they have decided to be grateful for. "Same time next week?" he said. "Same time next week," Sloane said. She walked out into the January cold and sat in her car in the medical center parking lot and cried for 10 minutes. The inconvenient kind again, the private kind. And then she drove back up the interstate toward Kingswood Ridge Road and the old house where the lights were on, and Eleanor was making dinner, and the third stair still creaked like a doorbell, and Harold the Crow was silent in his tree, keeping whatever counsel crows keep in winter. In May, Eleanor planted the garden. She started with the Cherokee purple tomatoes, pressing each seed into the warm, dark soil with her thumb, the way Peggy had shown her in the first spring. Then the Vortex beans, then the butternut squash, from the same saved seeds, the variety that had been growing in this particular soil since 1987, and knew by now exactly what it was doing. Harold the Crow watched from his maple tree with his customary expression of detached editorial judgment. The Winooski was running high with snowmelt, audible from the back porch in the early morning. The hills above the valley were the green of new growth, improbable and annual and entirely reliable. Down the road 3 miles south, a neighbor Eleanor had never met was decanting this year's maple syrup into small glass jars, one of which would arrive at the Sterling house door within the week, as it had every year for as long as anyone could remember. Eleanor pressed the last seed into the earth. She sat back on her heels. She looked at the bed, dark soil, the faint promise of green, the whole patient arithmetic of seeds that do not know they are remarkable, only that they are pointed at the light. She thought about Peggy. She thought about the letter still in her nightstand. She thought about a grocery list from 1974 and a pressed violet and the recipes in 3 different handwritings and 10 years of footsteps worn soft into the hallway floor. She thought, I was here. I stayed. And everything that mattered because someone stayed. She brushed the soil from her hands. She stood up. She went inside. The screen door closed behind her with its familiar sound, wood against wood, the lightest possible declaration of return. And the garden held the seeds, and the May light came through the maples, and Harold the Crow said one single definitive thing from his branch, and then was quiet. In the kitchen, the gingerbread was already in the oven. No, that would come in December. There was time. There was finally time.